And an important announcement, please turn off your cell phones. Industry estimates currently place OPEC compliance at about 68% of their announced cutbacks, with the Saudis potentially cutting more than their requirement. Is this level of compliance from the other OPEC members sufficient to avoid the wrath of the Saudis and a potential flooding of the oil market? Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that?
I wouldn't worry about any voluntary cutbacks from OPEC. I think they're incapable of voluntary cutbacks. But voluntary cutbacks is not the reason that OPEC exports are about 5 million barrels a day less than they were 6 to 7 years ago. It's not voluntary cutbacks that is going to be limiting their exports. It's 25-cent gasoline in Caracas and 50-cent gasoline in Saudi Arabia. And if you think that's cheap, you ought to see what they pay to generate power. Don't forget, in Saudi Arabia, all the power that is generated in the Middle East is done by burning oil and natural gas. They don't have coal, they don't have hydro, and we don't want them to have nuclear. So that means that they're burning the same fuel that we expect them to export to us. But have you ever checked what a hydroelectricity costs in Saudi Arabia? It costs a cent a kilowatt. You know why? Because the utility that is burning oil up the smokestack to generate electricity is paying 7 cents a gallon. So you don't have to worry about any voluntary cutbacks. Believe me, they are rapidly cannibalizing their own export capacity. And while OPEC is by no means homogeneous, while there are huge political, cultural, and religious divisions that would separate a country like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, there's one common denominator that binds them all. Everybody's got a God-given right to consume as much cheap energy as they feel like it. And any regime that wants to get in the way of that is a regime quickly showing the door. To its credit, the Iranian government in 2007, Iran, the fourth largest crude producer in the world, but one of the largest importers of gasoline. Why? Because would you want to invest in a refinery where gasoline sells at 25 cents a gallon? Well, they went and they tried to raise the price of gasoline in Iran. There were riots in Tehran, and the government had to back down. That's the real issue. Now, not to say that we're any better than they. I live 90 miles from Niagara Falls, and where I live, people think they got a God-given right to consume as much hydroelectricity as they feel like. And I guess I understand how people who live 90 miles away from Gawar might have the same feeling about oil prices as people in Toronto might feel about hydroelectric prices. But remember that every barrel of oil that goes up a smokestack in Saudi Arabia at 7 cents a gallon, or goes into a tank in Caracas for a taxi at 25 cents a gallon, is a barrel of oil that you don't get to burn.
Thanks, Jeff. Dennis?
Well, you can also say the same thing. That program occurs in Nigeria also. I mean, the cost of gasoline in Nigeria is comically low. The cost of gasoline in Iran is comically low, and it's very hard to argue with Jeff on this issue. These people continue to, the regimes have raised the level of expectation of the standard of living on the part of their people, and the only way to give that to them is through extraordinarily, inordinately, hugely subsidized crude oil, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So Jeff's absolutely right. For every barrel that is lost there, it's a barrel that we're not going to get here. How can one argue? I bow in his direction, say, you got it.
But is there a risk that when Saudi sees Venezuela perhaps not cutting as much as they're supposed to, that Saudi Arabia at some point loses patience with the rest of the cartel and says, here's some extra crude on the market, and you're going to suffer more pain than we will?
I would argue that risk is extremely minimal. I would argue a bigger risk is that exports from OPEC will continue to decline as they have for the last 5 to 6 years. And if not for our dear friend, Comrade Putin in Russia, who picked up all the slack from 2000 to 2005, we would have seen triple-digit oil prices a lot sooner, which I guess would have been a good thing for most of the folks here.
Okay, this is one of those questions that I was hoping to disguise by the flood of questions coming from the floor. If you were a CEO of a Canadian crude oil producer with debt standing at 2 times cash flow, would you establish hedge positions for the next 12 months at current forward market prices around $55 a barrel? Dennis, perhaps.
I wouldn't even hesitate. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm sorry?
Yes. How can you not? That doesn't mean that one has to hedge the next 15 years forward. That doesn't mean, and hedges are available that far out. That doesn't mean that one has to hedge 7 years forward. But if one is attempting to bring a project on for the next 3 years and doesn't hedge at least a third to a half of it, I think you're wrong. I think you're going to be doing yourself a disservice. I think you're going to be doing your shareholders a disservice. So my answer is, yeah, you damn well better.
I would disagree. I would disagree because the dream.
Next question.
I would disagree because the dream of every oil producer in Calgary, every junior oil producer in Calgary, is, of course, to be bought out. To be bought out by a Statoil, or bought out by an Exxon, or bought out by a BP. And, of course, if you hedge, what are you hedging? You're hedging your takeover value. Let me tell you what the big attribute of this place is. The big attribute of this place isn't the 135 billion gallons of oil trapped in the oil sands. I mean, that's part of the equation, and certainly in a world running out of oil, there's a lot of folk who'd be interested in that. But just as important an attribute is where it is. Why are billions more invested in the Athabasca than the Orinoco? The Orinoco in Venezuela has a comparable resource. Slightly different approach. Pay attention, Murray, because think globally, okay? I know people get fussed with royalty, but believe me, you get a lot more fussed when you get expropriated. And that's what happens to ConocoPhillips and Exxon, okay? Because in most places in the world, people have come to this funny conclusion that hydrocarbons, particularly when they're trading over $100 a barrel, ought to be owned and ran by the state. And in fact, in very few places in the world do we not have that notion. So where would you rather invest? In the Orinoco, in the Venezuelan oil sands, where you or maybe your competitor has just been expropriated? Or in Fort Mac, where all a multinational has to do to be a good corporate citizen is sponsor a minor hockey team? Okay? That translates into multiples, okay? Because the more that Comrade Chavez is going to be nationalizing Exxon in Venezuela, the bigger the multiple that Exxon is going to be paying to gain access to the 135 billion gallons of reserves held in the oil sands. And when you hedge, what you do is you hedge your takeover value. And ultimately, let me tell you, this place, the ownership of this place, is going to change. Because depending upon your view of the investment climate in Nigeria and Kazakhstan right now, the Canadian oil sands represents about 70% of the investable oil reserves in the world. By investable, I mean where a private company can come in, own the resource, develop the resource, and even more importantly, after developing it, not being expropriated. And every year, that number goes up. Not because it changes to the Canadian oil sands, but because every year another oil patch somewhere in the world becomes out of bounds for private investment. Ultimately, the huge payoff